It's fantastic to be here on the East Coast again. I flew in last night. It's about 6:30 West Coast time, which is sort of where my body is right now. I know this is the time of day I particularly enjoy talking about evidence and cost and benefits. It's just really exciting to me. So let's just get started on this thing here. So what we're going to do today is talk about what we've been doing in Washington State. We've been at this business that I think that Todd sounds like you're wanting to get going on here in the series where we've been at it now for about 15 or a little bit more years now. The state has been seriously focusing on evidence, not just in criminal justice, but in education and child welfare as well. And so I'm going to try to, in these few minutes we have this morning, talk about what we've done, the things we've learned, some of the mistakes we've made, and where we're heading. The bottom line is that we're now writing budgets, state budgets in the state of Washington, increasingly using evidence about what works to achieve outcomes. In this case, we're talking about crime today. So what works to reduce crime and can also give taxpayers a better return on their bucks. And that's particularly important right now because we're having to cut our budget. The last couple legislative sessions have been all about budget cuts in the state of Washington. The next legislative session that begins in January will also be about budget cuts. Our economy, as almost every state, has been suffering. And so we've been using evidence on trying to figure out what to cut and particularly what not to cut. And so we've been writing budgets now for a number of years in a row using this information. We'll talk about how all that has come about, both technically, some of the numbers end of it, and then politically, how the transformation that's happened a little bit in the state of Washington. So there's Olympia. I want to emphasize that this is real world stuff that we're talking about here. That's the state capital of Washington State there, on one of the many sunny days that we have there in the beautiful Northwest. And so the capital's right there. The Seattle, we're looking north, that's the salt water, it's the bottom of the Sound. We're looking north there, Seattle's just up around the corner. My institute's right there. Our job, we are a wholly owned subsidiary of the legislature. We're the nonpartisan research staff of the legislature. I'll talk about that in a moment. Our job is to feed that information into that capital. And in the interest of government accountability, which always have to be toward my house, turns out is right there. If I say anything today that you get angry, you can come back and talk to me, and we can sit out on my porch. You can, people that my bosses are those senators and representatives. You can get me fired if I say anything that's bad for the state of Washington. So I want to talk about this because what we're doing here is in the real world. It's like what goes into red. The legislature is going to be in town again in January. Actually, we're coming on special session at the end of, and we're going to write a budget. So what's going to go into that budget? That's the idea. And so increasingly we've been putting evidence about what works to improve outcomes and to spend taxpayers' dollars in an efficient manner. So my institute is a nonpartisan institute. It was created in 1983, so we've been around a while now, over a quarter of a century of experience of how you take evidence and how you get it into the policy process, both in the legislative branch and in the executive branch in terms of the operating agencies. It's a general purpose research institute, so we're going to be talking about criminal justice today, but we served and do all the things in the area of education and child welfare and all the other areas that we ask for. All the projects that we are directed to us come to us from the legislature. We don't come up with our own agenda. What will happen there in the Capitol is the legislature will convene, they'll write a bill, usually in the budget bill, and then they'll say to the institute, they'll say, study this topic. How can we reduce juvenile crime and do it in the most efficient using the best techniques? They'll send us a language like that. It'll be written in law, and then it'll say, institute, come back the following session and give us some information on this. So that's the process that's involved. Everything that I'll talk about today has been passed by that legislature in terms of the assignments to produce this information. So that's how we work. We have a board of directors, equal number of Republicans and Democrats, equal number of members from the Senate and the House. So it's built as being the nonpartisan unit that the legislature turns to when they want nonpartisan advice. Now, it's a partisan body. Legislature is a partisan body. So they want partisan advice too, but when they want nonpartisan advice, well-reasoned evidence, they turn to the get that information. These are some of the areas that I've mentioned that we've worked in, where we've been asked what works to reduce teen births, what works to reduce crime, what works to reduce child abuse and neglect. I've listed the years there in which the legislature has made those specific assignments in the form of legislation to us. They've also increasingly asked us about what are the costs and benefits. I'm an economist. When I look at these things, I say there's many ways you can reduce crime. Let's try to rank them. Where do we get the most crime reduction per taxpayer dollar? And we use that kind of information to help us sort through public policies. So that's the general thing. Today we're going to be talking about the crime outcome, but I'd be love to talk to you about the other outcomes as well, because we've done work and continue to do work in all those other areas that you see up there. So before we get to the bottom here, what we've learned, I'd say after all these years, is that it's increasingly possible for a smart state. I hope Washington is. I think New Jersey, I hope, wants to be a smart state. Is a smart state maybe already? Maybe wants to get smarter. I don't know. But it's increasingly possible to use evidence to identify what I'll call a portfolio of crime-fighting resources. That is, there is more and more evidence, good evidence, especially in the last 10 or 20 years, about what works to reduce crime and what doesn't work to reduce crime. If you go back to the literature from the 1970s and the 1960s, even the 1980s, there's not that many good studies on which you can hang your hat. But there's more evidence today. So the smart state is going to be the one that figures out how to use that evidence and get it into public policy. And that's really the purpose, I think, of a public policy institute here or mine, to try to get that information channeled into the policy process. I think it's also possible to do benefit cost analysis, return on investment, so that you can say, where do taxpayers get likely to get the best, the most kids to graduate from high school per dollar? That's their output. In this case today, crime. We want to reduce crime. What kind of combination of policies can we put together? So the smart state's going to recognize, I think, that the science is moving along on this area. We're farther along than we were even a decade or two ago. And how can we get those numbers into the policy process? One of the things that we've learned, and especially in the criminal justice area here, but not just the criminal justice area, and in other areas as well, is that you want to focus your resources, or scarce resources, on the people who need the work the most. In the case of offenders, it's focusing on higher risk juvenile or adult offenders. This is a principle, I know Ed's going to talk about it here later on, but we've taken this risk principle to heart, and we've really been allocating our resources away from offenders that are, they may do minor crime, but we're focusing more of our resources on offenders that do more serious crimes. This is a good thing to do. Assessment technologies are out there, are increasingly improved along. It's also possible to implement programs with quality control. The field is learning more and more about that. This is what I like to think of as Starbucks. Starbucks has really learned how to take its market and do quality control and maintain it after all these years. The original store was in Seattle. And, I went to the original store when there was only one Starbucks store in Pike Place Market. Now, of course, worldwide. You can argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but they know how to do their product with quality, replicated in place after place, and to maintain it so that their stockholders themselves happy. It's increasingly possible to do that with the kinds of programs that you run or that we run in the state of Washington. How you do the program year after year and maintain high quality. There's a science about that, and people are learning more about it. Again, the smart state's going to be the one that takes advantage of that, just like Starbucks does. And finally, it's even possible, amazingly, I think, now to put all this stuff, once in my case the legislature has made those things, to put it back into the state budgets so that you actually get those returns to your taxpayers. So it completes the budgetary cycle. So we'll talk about these points here a little bit more. We're going to talk about, I just want to talk about crime, the big picture. My members of the legislature like big picture things, and so this is going to be a graph. You can get these data, I think, for New Jersey. This is going to be data for Washington State. We're going to look at how things have changed from 1980 to the most recent year data that I have. I just haven't updated this chart. How things have changed since 1980. Here's the good news. Economists always have good news and bad news, right? So the good news is that crime rates in Washington State are down. They're about 43% lower. I've got the 2010 data. It's even a little bit lower than the 2009 data that you see there. That's fantastic news. It means that if you visit Seattle today, you've got about a 43% less chance of being a victim of a serious property or violent crime than if you visited back in 1980. 43 or so percent less chance. That's fantastic news. It's unambiguous good news. We're delighted about that news in the state of Washington. We're happy, happy, happy about that news. Here's the bad news. The bad news is how much money we've been taking from taxpayers, in part, to fight that crime rate. We've been spending, over those years, I took all the money that we spend on police, the juvenile courts, the adult courts, and the criminal parts of those courts, prosecutor's office, defender's offices, local corrections, juvenile and adult, state corrections, juvenile adult, added them all up, take inflation out of it, so these are real dollars, divide by the number of households, so this is like per household spending, it's like a property tax. And we've increased the amount of money that we spend on criminal justice in Washington by about 100%, doubled the amount of money that we take out of households' pockets to spend on this criminal justice system. We built a lot of prison cells, particularly in the 80s and the 90s. We funded more police on the street. Those are two crime-fighting resources. Prisons reduce crime, more police on the street reduce crime. There's a strong evidentiary about that. You can be smart about each of those things, smarter than dumber, but those will reduce crime. And part of the reason the blue line is down is because we've been spending more money. But what we're really thinking about with this evidence base is that we want to, first of all, note that we've been able to start to level that off in recent years. That's a good, very encouraging sign. Crime rates are going down. Well, I'd love to come back here in a few years and show you that as a result of the portfolio changes that we've been making to how we fight crime in Washington, crime rates are likely to keep going down, but that we've been able to turn around that taxpayer line there. What we want to do is shift the portfolio. We want to get out of the things that we're doing that are dumb, that don't solve so many crimes for the dollar of spending, take those dollars, move over to the kinds of resources and policies that give a higher return on investment. That's really all we've been doing in Washington State. We've been shifting our portfolio around. If you have your retirement assets and some money there, all we're doing is shifting the equivalent of shifting your retirement assets from things that aren't earning you any money to things that are earning you more money. That's what we're doing with our crime-fighting resources. We're recognizing that certain kinds of incarceration, for example, reduce crime, but it spends a lot of money to reduce crime that way. And so we're taking those dollars, shortening sentence lengths, for example, shifting the money over to some programs that solve a lot more crime for each of those dollars, and we're ending up in a better place. We're ending up with lower crime rates, and we're starting to see now the turnaround, I think, in that taxpayer line. So that's the big picture about what we want to do. When the legislature asks us to take a look at things, this is what we do. We go through a three-step process. They'll say to us, what works to reduce crime? The very first thing that we do, we don't do any economics at this stage. What we're doing here is we do evidentiary reviews of the evidence. We go out and we get every study that's been done, not only in Washington State, but throughout the country. Any rigorous study, we have scientific standards that we place on the evidence, and we meta-analyze them for all of those that have that technical stuff in you. We come to a conclusion about what works. Do drug courts work to reduce crime? Does prison work to reduce crime? We gather all the evidence, mush them all together, and come up with an average, a weighted, sort of like a Standard & Poor's 500. What has been the long-term return of 500 stocks in the United States? Well, what we'll do is here we'll take every research on a particular topic, and we'll come to a conclusion about whether it works or not. That's the first step. The second step then is to do the economic step. Once we've got something that we think works, we then say, well, how much does it cost to do that program? How much does incarceration cost? How much do drug courts cost? And what kind of benefits do those crime reductions generate? So now we've got the benefit side in dollar terms, and we've got the cost of running the programs in dollar terms, so you can do benefit cost ratio, return on investment. All of the work that we've done has been geared toward that. And then in an investment analysis 101, the third and final step is to say, well, now that we've got a list of what works and we rank them by benefit cost, what kinds of combinations of those policies are we going to put together into a portfolio, Washington's portfolio, to try to get lower crime rates in the state and not have to spend so much money. So this is an investment analysis 101.
I hope that your investment advisor is doing that with your retirement resources. The Washington State Legislature hires me to do that, in this case with their criminal justice information. What ways can we shift our portfolio around to get less crime and not spend so much of the taxpayers' dollars? So that, we get all done with this. I produce a consumer reports. Basically what I'm in the consumer reports business. Here's a copy of consumer reports, right? This is like, you want to know how to buy, we all know about this as consumers. You want to find out a good camera, you go here and you find the camera issue of consumer reports. Basically, that's what the legislature has set the Institute up to do, is provide a consumer reports, a listing, a ranking of where do they get the best bang for their taxpayers' buck, whether it's in crime reduction, education outcomes, child welfare and stuff. And we produce these lists. They all look the same, because I want individual legislators to kind of get used to seeing this the same way we get used to seeing it in consumer reports. Members that serve on the education committee see these things ranked. In this case, it might be for student test scores or graduation rates. They see the same kind of structure of the analysis. This is the crime one here. We do that thing. So the concept is, how do you take this evidence and get it in front of policymakers, executive cabinet members, others that want to use that information? This is the approach we've taken, sort of the consumer reports approach. Let's take a look at a couple of examples of there, and to give you a little better flavor about what we come up with when we're trying to pick the winners from the losers. This is, we'll take a look at some programs for adult offenders, juvenile offenders, and some prevention programs. And these are from our July 11, just this year, the results from these things. Here's cognitive behavioral treatment. You heard about a lot of that. I'm sure you're doing some of that here. This is a group of things. This is what the numbers would tell us there. We did a meta-analysis of 36 pretty much rigorous studies. I actually read, I think it was about 70 or so evaluations of cognitive behavioral treatment. I threw out most of the studies because they didn't have a valid comparison group, treatment group. They didn't meet our standards for research, so I threw those studies out. What I was left with was 36 studies that are, some of them are random assignment, the gold standard. Some of them aren't random assignment, but they're very good research studies. 36 studies on which I think I can hang my hat, so that when I go testify in front of my legislature about whether this works or not, that's the evidentiary base that I come to that conclusion. What we find is that when we analyze that is that we can expect about a 6% reduction in criminal recidivism rates for the typical person that would go through a cognitive behavioral program, whether it be in the prison or in a community setting. About a 6% reduction. Now my heart was hoping for a 60% reduction in recidivism rate. It really was. And my heart was saying, God. But my head shouted down to my heart after reading those, I better believe 6%. If I'm going to testify in front of Senator Hargrove's committee, the all-powerful member of the Senate, I better tell him 6%. I can't tell him 60%. It's 6%. That's what the evidence would indicate you can expect. And in terms of recidivism reductions, it's about a 63% compared to 59%, a 6%, 4 percentage point reduction there. So the next question is the economic one. So is 6% worth it? Is it worth it or not? It seems like a small number, but is it worth it? It turns out it's one of the best things that we can do with taxpayer dollars for that population. Again, I wish it was 60% reduction, but 6% is pretty good. And when we do an economic analysis, a cost-benefit analysis, we can deliver that program. It's typically run in groups. We can deliver it for about $217 per offender, per participant in the prison system, at least in the state of Washington, a little bit more in the community. And that 6% reduction in criminal recidivism generates about $2,500 of benefit to taxpayers over the lifetime. So it's already well paying for itself just from taxpayer perspective. And it also means there's going to be fewer crimes, fewer victims out there. When we put a price tag on that, we get about $8,000. So you get about $10,000 of net benefit for that $200 cost. It's got a fantastic benefit to cost ratio, an internal rate of return that you can't believe. We also do investment analysis. We run our models thousands of times, testing to see what's the chance, if all of our assumptions in the model are wrong, what's the chance that this program would fail? And we get less than 1% chance that this program wouldn't even break even. So what I'd be able to provide the legislature, and what this institute here might want to do, is sort of risk and return. The return is, $50 of benefit per dollar of cost with very little chance of this being a dumb thing. very little chance that you're going to go broke with this program. So it bubbles up to the top of our list when we do a full benefit cost analysis and risk analysis of it. Now, I'm not going to go through the other things up here unless there are questions later. But we've ranked other things. We've looked at adult drug courts, drug treatment in prison, education programs. You can see the number of studies that we found that are credible, our conclusion about how it affects recidivism rates, and then our benefit costs. Some things are pay off, some things don't pay off. If you do intensive supervision where you're just counting contacts, where you're not treating drug problems, cognitive problems, if you just do that, that doesn't work. There's actually a little bit of evidence that recidivism rates go up 1%. 23 studies, many of them random assignment studies. So if you're spending money on that, that's a loser. We've stopped doing that in the state of Washington. We've shifted the money into some of the programs that make much more sense to us, and I think that's part of the reason why we're starting to see some of the turnaround. Juvenile offender programs also look terrific to us. Again, we're interested in crime reduction. We don't, if you're a victim, you don't really care if you're a victim, so we want to spend, whether it's done by a juvenile or an adult, so you want to take that. We find out in the juvenile sector that we get some of the biggest returns here in terms of reduction. Some of them haven't been analyzed as much as others, so there's a little bit more variance, a little bit more risk in terms of the result, but the return looks awfully good to us. So we've been shifting juvenile offender programs. One of the things our legislature has been doing is taking money out of the adult system and putting it into the juvenile system. Because in the long run, that looks like that's the best way for us to turn those curves around there that we saw earlier there. That you get more bang for the buck in the juvenile system because you're stopping crime right during the high crime years, avoiding crime during the next year. So those are part of the lessons that you can learn when you try to take an overall look at this. In terms of prevention, we've also included that in our portfolio. We've looked at preschool. We now fund preschool in part for crime avoidance reasons. Other reasons as well, additional to crime avoidance. We also do some child welfare programs, Nurse Family Partnership, and some others that we've begun to fund, not just because of what they can do in the education sector, but because of what they can deliver in the crime sector as well. So those are some of the examples. Those are the things that go into our consumer reports. There are others up here that I didn't show on this thing, but that's some of the findings. Now that's the picking part. That's doing the numbers. That's sitting there, going through the evidence, doing the cost-benefit analysis, getting the consumer reports ready for the legislature. That's the part I was trained to do. That's what I love. My job over these, I've worked for the Washington State Legislature for 35 years, 35 legislative sessions. This is this is the passing part. This is turning those numbers into policies. So now I'm taking my numbers hat off and I'm delivering the numbers to my legislature. Here's what our legislature has been able to do. We first began this effort in the mid-1990s in the juvenile justice system. The legislature said, gee, we got juvenile crime going up now. What can we do that makes sense evidence-wise? So we began, that's when we first did our first review. It was just of juvenile justice programs, what was smart. Some of those same programs you just saw were the ones that we did initially back then. And then the legislature began to fund those programs in a serious way, statewide serious implementation in Washington. Those programs continue to be the bulwark of what we do in the juvenile justice system. They're even more, we're spending more money on that. We're getting a higher rate of those programs among all the kids that would be eligible as assessed. And I'm pretty sure that our budget deficit, which is a problem in the state, would be considerably higher today had we not been doing those programs. Because all those kids now would be adults, they'd be in the adult prison system, or a lot of them would be. And so that's saving us money. I mentioned earlier in the 2002 legislature, we did a study that found out that you could cut some prison sentences, you could reduce the severity. There's very little evidence that the severity of sentences have much crime deterrence, at least certain kinds of sentences. And so we did that for drug offenders. We cut length of stay of drug offenders, took the money, which is a very low return on investment for those dollars, not zero, but very low, and shifted it into the drug treatment side of things. Drug courts, other kinds of drug treatment were funded. We think that's also saving us a tremendous amount of money today. That was a direct result of the work. The 2007 legislature really began using this information in a big way. That's when we made a big push. It was before the recession hit. There was extra money lying around. We made a big change, an increase in both the juvenile, the adult, and the prevention program, taking that portfolio that we just saw. And we started taking as a result of this, we started taking whole prisons that were slated to be constructed. constructed. And anticipating those results, we've taken those prisons off the construction sheets there. So we're no longer building a couple prisons worth in Washington State as a result of the program, that shift in the portfolio that we were talking about. We've done it in the same way in early child education. I'm not going to go into those results today, but because early child education looks so favorable to us economically, not just for crime, but a number of areas, our legislature has taken steps now to include it in our definition, our constitutional definition of what a basic education is in the state of Washington, to include early child education, and almost entirely as a result of that return on investment analysis that we've been able to do. And even in the face of these budget cutbacks, we're spending more money on these evidence-based programs than we used to on net. We've had to cut back all over state government, but the evidence has been to reduce other things before you reduce these programs. And in fact, we've increased some of the funding for juvenile programs. So even in the face of budget deficits, the legislature has been actually using this information, I think, to good work. Now, so now we're talking. Now I'm talking a little bit here in this overview about the picking them part, my personal favorite. The passing them part, I enjoy working with the legislature. That's the legislature. That's that. But now there's the doing them part. This is the executive branch. And there's some evidence-based information, I think, that Ed will talk about, I'm pretty sure, that we tried to take to heart in Washington State. 3 principles I'll mention here today. And one, again, is on assessment. What we've learned is that if you want to do these programs and you want to do them well, whether they're juvenile programs, adult programs, you really need some assessment tools, risk and protective factor kind of tools, to make sure that the programs are going to the right person. We started off not doing that in Washington, at least in the adult sector, and we ended up putting non-drug offenders, people without drug problems, I should say, in drug treatment programs. A dumb thing. We evaluated it, we weren't getting any results, we changed that. We now have assessment processes in place to make sure that we're getting the right person into the right program and doing it by actuarial tools rather than by wishing by golly. So a very important thing that we've learned, we have tools now in the juvenile system, the adult system, integrated tools that allow us to tailor the programs to the right person. Quality control that I mentioned, the Starbucks thing here. We learned this lesson the hard way too. We started doing those juvenile programs early on without quality control. We thought all you had to do was just sort of pick the program, give money to the juvenile courts, and they'd go off and do the right thing. What we learned is that they did part of the right thing, and they hired the right kind of people that did the right program by the book. We got fantastic results, but on average, they hired people that weren't doing the program, and they were getting no results. We learned that through random assignment evaluation. So once we knew that, we came back, the legislature came back in 2002 and said, if you don't put a quality assurance system in place that makes sense, we're going to cut the program funding for all of those programs that you had started in the juvenile justice system. That was the light bulb that went on. We knew at that stage that we had to take the Starbucks approach to getting the programs in place. And we've built a system in place now that assessment and quality control for the delivery of the programs that I think is a real model program for around the country about how to do it, how you train people, how you fire people if they're not delivering the programs with fidelity, how you retrain people, how you train the trainers in that. We have a whole statewide system in place now to do that. And finally, even more boring than all that is the getting the right funding formula. You have state level government, you got local level government, you got people responding to different incentives, whose budget's going to gain in this. You've got to set up the funding formulas. These involve boring, terrible negotiations between with everybody at the table. Some of my least favorite time in these 35 years have been in these discussions, but they're critical if you're going to get all the actors playing on singing to the same tune. You've got to get those funding formulas so that the right incentives are to do the right program, to do these assessments, to do the quality assurance. So that very important sort of steps that we've learned in Washington State on how to do the programs once you pick them, once you pass them through your legislature, and then how do you actually do them in the field to get the results. So accountability. Once you've done all that, we've been trying to keep track of how we're doing statewide on some of the outcomes. We do individual evaluations, but legislators like big time picture stuff. So one of the things that we do now is we tie all those results specifically to our state prison forecast. And we do it every year. We just updated our forecast 3 weeks ago that's going to go into the capital and operating budgets for the coming legislative session. So all the money that the state is spending on those programs, juvenile programs, adult programs, prevention programs, we go through a process, a formal process with the people in that town of Olympia, the analysts who get together, goes through our formal caseload forecasting process to forecast the caseloads, what they're going to be, given those investments that have been made. That's part of the reason how you deliver the results back to taxpayers, so part of the reasons why you don't overbuild the prison system, because you're planning on the results of those programs and you're adjusting your prison forecast directly to reflect those investments that were made, and you're tracking those investments year after year to make sure you're delivering the results. So that's a key thing there, I think, in terms of just budgetary, making the whole thing work. Now, I'm going to throw up a couple numbers here. These are not rigorous studies here, but these are the kind of things that I look for, whether this whole thing is paying off. First, we'll look at juvenile crime here. We'll look at the United States and Washington. We'll look at how things have changed since 1990. Here's the juvenile arrest rate. This is all kinds of arrests for Part 1 kinds of crimes in the United States. Great news here in the United States as a whole, by the way. The juvenile arrest rate is 48, well, as of 2006, was 48% lower than it was in 1990. Terrific news. But Washington has beat the U.S. Here we are. Here's Washington's rate. We're 62% lower. We're beating the U.S. It could be coincidence. I don't think so, but it could be coincidence. That's right when we began implementing those programs, partly with fidelity, partly without fidelity. And guess what? Right when we did that fidelity thing, we started firing people that weren't doing it. That was right there, and that's when we saw the gap even merge further. This isn't a rigorous piece of research yet. We haven't done it with all the states, all the kinds of things that economists would want to do to try to tease that out. But if I'm not seeing this, then I'm worried. I'm worried that all the work that we're doing is not coming to bear any fruit. But what we're finding is that the programs, I think, are probably what's going on there and why we're seeing that favorable result. Now, the last one I want to show you here, this one's going to be the hardest slide of the morning here in terms of technical stuff. We're keeping track year by year of our prison crime relationship. Because if all the things we're doing that we've been talking about this morning, we ought to be seeing a difference in this relationship. So let's just do a chart here, our last chart of the morning. This is our incarceration rate. New Jersey has an incarceration rate. Is that your rate is much higher than our rate? You're more than we are. But this is a Washington's incarceration rate. This tells you about how many people you have locked up in the state prison system on any given day as a proportion of your total population. We'll plot those numbers, and then this is going to be our crime rate over here. All the serious crimes, Part 1 crimes that get reported to police are going to be plotted over here, again, per 1,000 population. So if you think the prison doesn't work, doesn't affect crime rate at all, you'd expect to see a real flat line there. That no matter how you change your incarceration rate, it doesn't have any effect on your crime rate. If you're in the group that thinks that prison really does work, you'd expect to see a pretty steep line there, that even small changes in your incarceration rate have a significant effect on your crime rate. The truth, at least in Washington State, and I think around the country from the best research, is that the truth is somewhere in the middle of those two extreme positions. What we found, let's look at the numbers for Washington State here. This is where we were back in 1980. We had an incarceration rate of under 2 and a crime rate up around 70. Like the rest of the nation, we began to increase our incarceration rate for a few years down along the bottom, and our crime rate started to go down. And then we passed some sentencing changes in the state of Washington that caused our incarceration rate to drop. We lowered incarceration, and the crime rate started to go back up. And then we did this. We started to increase our incarceration rate, as every state has, and our crime rate has come down. So it looks like there's a relationship there. We did an econometric study of this, and we found out that there is a relationship there. We controlled for all kinds of stuff. We also compared our results to those same results from there's about 22 rigorous studies that have been done around the country. It was a very similar result. You get that relationship. It's sort of in between those two extreme views. It's not a completely flat curve. It's not a completely steep curve. But there's what economists call an elasticity. That if you want to lower your crime rate, you can increase your incarceration rate. If you put everybody in prison, your crime rate will go to 0, right? You have 100% incarceration rate, you'll have no crime as we measure it. If you let everybody out of prison, you have a 0 incarceration rate. I can guarantee you the crime rate in Washington will be higher. We know a lot about recidivism of offenders. So the The question is going to be, where do you want to be along that line? The important point for this morning, I think, is that we wanted to break that relationship. The whole purpose of all the programs that we've been talking about here is to break that relationship. In the words of an economist, to shift that demand curve. And here's what we've been able to do since 2006, when we began seriously seeing the effects in implementing those programs that we're talking about. Look what's happened. This may seem real wonkish here, but this is pretty much a phenomenal result here. Notice that we've been decreasing our incarceration rate. It's dropping. We're going down. Incarceration rate is starting to lower in Washington State, but our crime rate is going down. It's not going back up. And I think the reason is because of the programmatic changes that we've been making in both the juvenile system and the adult system, and even some of the early intervention programs that are now as the kids get into their older age. In fact, if we had stayed on that green line, in order to have gotten the crime rate that we're now enjoying here in 2010, we would have had to build about 5 or 6 more prisons. We would have had to have an incarceration rate way out here. And that would be, costing taxpayers today a couple $1 billion more in annual operating costs in Washington. So the net effect, and I would encourage this institute to try to keep track of these numbers for New Jersey as you start to embark upon this, is that you want to be able to see something like this happening in New Jersey, where you make a bunch of policy changes over the years, in both juvenile and adult, and you start to see this kind of thing. So we're delivering less crime to Washington citizens today and not having to spend so much money because we're not having to put so many people in prison as we just did. And we're breaking that long-term linkage that otherwise existed for the whole record, which we have there, about 27 years of data. We're seeing a change here. So very encouraging results. I get each year's new data. I get anxious to see what it's going to be to make sure that we're heading in the right direction there. So just to kind of summarize there, then, I think it's, again, increasingly possible for a smart state, and Washington and New Jersey, I'm sure, want to be those, to use that evidence, to do some cost-benefit analysis, some return on investment. You really have to do that stuff, otherwise you're not going to know which of these are the best investments. We've learned that over and over again. To actually have the information used by policymakers, to implement the programs with fidelity. And it's also important, since it's baseball season, it's also important, for me at least, to keep my sanity working for a legislature for 35 years, to have a baseball player's mentality. I grew up in Southern California, actually, and hitter's mentality. Hitter, you go to the Hall of Fame if you're just successful a little over 30% of the time. That means you fail 70% of the time in baseball as a hitter. You go to the Hall of Fame. In policy work, working with a legislature, I'm not going to be 100% successful. We do numbers. They're not going to always go in there. If I can get my batting average up to 40 or 50%, I'm going to go into the policy wonkish cost-benefit Hall of Fame. That's my goal. It also helps my psychology to know that you're going to fail sometimes. You've got to go back in the dugout and you come back out and do your next cost-benefit analysis. So that's important to recognize that as you launch your institute here, that it takes a while and you're not always going to be successful, even if politics sings to different tunes. So if you're interested in any of the work that we've done here, everything is on our webpage. We have a brand new report that came out in July this year that sort of summarizes everything. Crime, child welfare, education, everything that we've been able to do is in this sort of consumer reports. In fact, let's just close with a little bit of fun here. I've been doing it for 35 years, so I really do know how to write boring, dumb-looking government reports like this. I've really gotten, I know how to do it. I didn't take up ballet dancing, I took up this kind of thing. And so after 35 years, I know how to do this. But what it really is, those consumer reports, there's a 2005 car issue, an annual auto issue, exclusive reliability ratings, unbiased ratings and reviews, 222 models. So let's just have a little PowerPoint fun. We'll change that. Annual criminal justice issue, exclusive rate, over 200 crime-related programs and policies. Best 2011 crime policies. There's actually the state capital of Washington State right there. Unbiased ratings and reviews, 222 programs, best and worst programs. Don't get ripped off, save thousands of taxpayers' dollars. Best programs that reduce crime and save taxpayers' money. That's the business I'm really in. That's what our institute does for our legislature. We produce that every year. if if I had done that, I would have gotten fired by sued by Consumer Reports, and then my legislature would have fired me had I done that. But basically, that's what it is. So instead of doing that, I opted for a boring, dumb-looking government report. But that's the basic information that we've been able to do in Washington with our institute, trying to get that information before the legislature, and we're starting to see some of the results, particularly in the crime area and in a couple of other areas of public policy as well. I'll close there. Thanks very much.